The sky had gone dark in the middle of the afternoon. Not the slow fading of evening, but something sudden and unexplained. A darkness that settled over the hill of Golgotha, as though the light itself had withdrawn from what was happening there. Some wept. Some stood watching without knowing what to do with what they were seeing. The soldiers remained at their posts. And then, after long hours on the cross, it was over. Jesus of Nazareth was dead. Jerusalem moved quickly after that. The Passover feast was close. There were preparations still to finish, lambs to slaughter, households to set in order. The religious leaders who had spent the better part of that week coordinating the arrest, steering the trial, and pressing Pilate for the execution were, in whatever private way they permitted themselves, relieved. The matter, as they had framed it, had been settled. But one man in that city was not moving toward a feast table. He was moving toward a decision that was going to cost him more than anything his Passover preparations required. His name was Joseph. He came from a town called Arimathea. And on that Friday afternoon, while Jerusalem was absorbed in its own concerns, he walked toward the residence of the Roman governor and asked for the body of a crucified man. No one in that city was watching him. No one recorded the moment he made the decision or what his face looked like when he did. The crowd had already begun to scatter. The disciples were in hiding. The priests were on their way back from Pilate with other things on their minds. He walked alone across a city that had no idea what he was carrying. Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin, the 71-member Supreme Council of Jewish religious and civil life. A seat on that council was not given to anyone. It was built across decades, years of demonstrated mastery of Torah, an unblemished personal reputation, and the accumulated trust of a community that watched its leaders closely. The men who sat there had spent their entire adult lives becoming the kind of people who were permitted to sit there. Luke describes Joseph with two words that carry more weight than a title ever could. He was, Luke writes, a good man and a righteous man. Not powerful, not celebrated, good, righteous. Those are character words, offered without qualification, and they matter more in the end than any credential attached to his name. Mark adds something about Joseph's interior life. He was waiting for the kingdom of God. That tells us Joseph was not simply a man who had found a comfortable position inside a well-established system and settled into it. He was looking for something the system was not providing. He sat in those council chambers with a longing that the council itself had no answer for, surrounded by men whose religion was entirely settled, while his own was still leaning forward into something it had not yet seen. Matthew tells us he was wealthy. John confirms he had become a disciple of Jesus. And then John adds the one word that changes everything that comes before it. He was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he was afraid of what the consequences would be if anyone knew. A good man, a righteous man, a man waiting for the kingdom, and a man who was afraid. All four of those things were true of the same person at the same time. That is who walked into Pilate's residence on that Friday afternoon. To be a secret follower of Jesus while sitting on the Sanhedrin was to occupy one of the most pressurized positions imaginable. Every session of that council was a session where the movement Jesus had started was being discussed, managed, and methodically opposed. Joseph was in those rooms. He heard the arguments against Jesus being built piece by men he had known for years. He heard the hostility accumulating. He watched a legal and religious case being constructed against someone he had come to believe was telling the truth. And nothing he said in those rooms is recorded. John's Gospel notes, in the broader context of that period, that fear of expulsion from the synagogue was keeping many people from openly acknowledging their belief in Jesus. That expulsion was not a merely spiritual consequence. It meant social severance. From the community, the relationships, the professional standing that an entire adult life had been spent building. It touched your family's place in the world. It reached into every room you had ever been trusted to enter. The cost was not hypothetical, and it was not small. The longer the silence lasted in that environment, the more costly it became to break it. There is a difference between staying silent when things are unresolved and staying silent when the man you followed is dead. At some point, silence stops being a circumstance you inhabit and becomes a decision you are actively making. And the name of that decision becomes harder to live with than the cost of speaking. That point arrived for Joseph on a Friday afternoon, and he stood up. Luke gives us one detail about Joseph that is easy to read past. He writes that Joseph had not consented to the council's decision and their action against Jesus. That sentence is placed with care. It separates Joseph from the majority of his colleagues at the most consequential moment of that entire week. When the Sanhedrin moved to hand Jesus over to Pilate, Joseph was not with them. He did not agree. What that actually looked like inside the room, the Bible does not tell us. Did he speak and find himself outvoted? Did he absent himself from that session entirely? Did he raise an objection and then watch the outcome proceed regardless? We cannot say, because the text does not say, and it would be dishonest to construct drama out of what Scripture leaves in silence. What Luke tells us clearly is this: Joseph had not consented. His name was not on that decision. And yet, the outcome happened. Jesus died at approximately the 9th hour of the day, what we would call mid-afternoon, around 3 o'clock. Mark records his final cry and the moment he breathed his last. It was the day of preparation, which meant the Sabbath was approaching. And this was not an ordinary Sabbath. It fell within the Passover, the most sacred observance in the Jewish year. Jewish law was clear. A body should not remain on the cross past sundown, and certainly not into a Sabbath of this weight. The chief priests and the Pharisees had already sent a request to Pilate that afternoon, that the legs of those crucified be broken to accelerate death, so the bodies could be removed before sundown. That request, made by the same men who had orchestrated the execution, reveals something about the particular division they had built inside themselves. They had set the death of Jesus in motion and were now absorbed in maintaining the purity of their Sabbath, working from within the same breath to honor a feast day they had spent the week desecrating. But Joseph was not making that kind of calculation. Mark uses one word to describe what Joseph did next that is easy to pass over without feeling its full weight. He writes that Joseph took courage and went to Pilate. The Greek word behind that phrase carries the sense of daring, the courage to act despite fear. This was not easy confidence. This was a man who understood exactly what he was risking and who stood up and walked forward into it anyway. He went in. He stated his purpose. He asked for the body of Jesus. Think about what that walk actually represented. Pilate's Jerusalem residence during the festival seasons, the Praetorium, was not a place you entered for a quiet, private conversation. Jerusalem during Passover was one of the most heavily populated moments in the Jewish year. Pilgrims had come in from across the entire region. The streets were dense and faces were known. Here was a sitting member of the Sanhedrin walking toward the Roman governor to claim the body of a man his own council had condemned as a blasphemer and handed over for crucifixion. There was no way to do this without being seen. No back channel. No anonymous intermediary. No way to keep his name at a comfortable distance from what he was doing. The moment Joseph entered that building and stated his purpose, he was a recognized person publicly identifying himself with a publicly condemned criminal. Pilate was surprised. Mark records that when Joseph made the request, Pilate was not yet certain Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion typically extended much longer, sometimes across days. He summoned the centurion who had overseen the execution to confirm the report. Once the death was verified, Pilate released the body. Now the work had to begin, and the time remaining was short. John tells us that Joseph and Nicodemus took the body and wrapped it in linen cloths with spices, following Jewish burial custom. The Sabbath was approaching. Everything that needed to happen had to happen before sundown. And this is where another man stepped into the garden, someone whose presence there arrived with the full weight of an earlier night attached to it. John is the only gospel writer who records that Nicodemus came to help with the burial. If you have read the Gospel of John from the beginning, that name arrives with full context. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a ruler of the Jews, and the man who had come to Jesus at night, carefully, in the dark, to ask questions he was not yet willing to ask in daylight. John's use of night in that earlier scene is not casual. Throughout his gospel, darkness carries the weight of concealment. Nicodemus had come shielded by the hour, curious, cautious, unwilling to be seen. He heard Jesus speak about being born of the Spirit, about the Son of Man being lifted up as Moses had lifted the serpent in the wilderness. He left without resolution, still processing, still unnamed in any public record as a follower. And now he was standing in a garden near the place of crucifixion, carrying approximately 100 Roman pounds of myrrh and aloes, roughly 75 pounds by modern measure. John gives that number deliberately. That quantity was not modest. It was the kind of preparation reserved for those of the highest honor, the burial of kings. It was extravagant, and it was entirely visible. The man who had once come in the dark to avoid being seen was now standing in an open garden carrying an unmistakable load. Two men who had kept their convictions private for a long time were now in the most watched city during the most observed week of the Jewish calendar, publicly performing an act of devotion. They were giving an honorable burial to the man their council had condemned. Whatever it was going to cost them, neither of them was calculating it anymore. John tells us that near the place of crucifixion there was a garden, and in that garden a new tomb that had never been used. Matthew gives the more specific detail. The tomb belonged to Joseph himself. He had hewn it from rock, Matthew uses that exact word, prepared well in advance, as men of means in that culture customarily arranged for themselves long before the need arrived. Joseph gave it. A rock-cut tomb in the ancient world was not a modest provision. It required skilled labor, careful planning, and real expense. It was a man's deliberate preparation for his own death, set aside years before the moment would come. Surrendering it on a Friday afternoon meant surrendering what he had held in reserve for himself. What Joseph did not know, could not have known, was that his decision in that moment was completing something written by the prophet Isaiah approximately 700 years before it happened. Isaiah chapter 53 describes a suffering servant who is rejected, who bears the weight of others' transgressions. Verse 9 reads, "He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death." Both parts of that verse are distinct and both matter. The first part, "assigned a grave with the wicked," describes the fate normally given to someone executed as a criminal. Crucified men were rarely granted dignified burials. Their bodies were often disposed of in a common grave, without ceremony, away from family. That was the expected end for anyone who died the way Jesus did. The second part, "with a rich man in his death," describes the actual outcome. Joseph's tomb was privately owned, newly carved, unused, and located in a garden. The expected outcome was overruled. not by force, by a free decision made under time pressure, by one man acting from love and conscience, completing what had been spoken when no one present in that garden had yet been born. The body was laid carefully inside, the linen wrapped in place. The stone rolled across the entrance. The Sabbath began. The garden went quiet. The tomb was sealed on Friday evening. The Sabbath came, and then came the day the Gospels pass over in near silence. Saturday. The Bible does not tell us where Joseph was on that day. It does not open that door. What we can see is what the wider circle of that story was doing. The disciples were gathered behind closed doors. John tells us they were there in fear. The women who had watched the burial were waiting, preparing more spices and ointments until the Sabbath would pass and they could return to the tomb. The city was observing the feast. The streets had moved on. The arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, all of it was already receding into the past tense for most of Jerusalem. Joseph does not appear in any of the resurrection accounts. He is not at the empty tomb on Sunday morning. He is not named at Pentecost. He does not appear again anywhere in the New Testament. The biblical record simply ends on him at the entrance of that garden, stone in place. He was not the first to see the risen Lord. He had no role in the proclamation of the resurrection. He was the man who did a specific thing at a specific moment, who gave what he had when it was needed. But while the garden was sealed and quiet, something else was happening on the other side of Jerusalem. Matthew tells us that on the morning of the Sabbath itself, the day after the crucifixion, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered and went to Pilate. Not to rest, not to observe the holy day in the way they had demanded it be observed by everyone else. They went to the Roman governor with another request. They said, "We remember that deceiver said, while he was still alive, that after 3 days he would rise. Command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, so his disciples cannot steal the body and tell the people he is risen from the dead." Pilate gave them a guard. They went to the garden, sealed the stone, and posted the watch. These were the men who had pressed for the crucifixion on theological grounds, who had argued before Pilate that a man claiming to be the Son of God deserved death. Joseph, on that same day, was not at the garden. He had given the tomb and walked away. He made no arrangements to watch the entrance, asked for no guard, held nothing in reserve. He had acted, and he had let go. 2 very different relationships with the same garden. One side working urgently to contain it, the other having simply, and at great cost, released it. Here is something worth pausing over before this story moves toward its end. Joseph likely believed in Jesus for some time before he openly acted on that faith. And during those years, he sat inside the institution most actively opposed to Jesus, not at a distance, not as a passive observer, but as a member of the council where the arguments against Jesus were being constructed and refined. The hostility was not external to him. It was in the room with him, delivered by colleagues he had known for decades, backed by the full weight of Torah scholarship. The belief survived that. Faith that holds under that kind of sustained, informed, proximate opposition is not fragile faith. It is something that has been tested at close range and has not broken. What it had not yet done was speak. But the interior thing, the conviction, the recognition, the private following, was real and intact. A long season of silence had not emptied him. Luke does not attach a qualifier to his character description of Joseph. He does not write that Joseph was a good man, despite his silence, or a righteous man, notwithstanding his fear. He simply writes, "A good man and a righteous man." The text describes the person. It does not reduce him to his most visible failure. The cross did not require Joseph to create a faith he had never had. It brought to the surface what had been gradually forming under pressure, and it brought it out suddenly when its growth demanded it. The act of walking toward Pilate was the completion of a long interior journey, arriving at the only possible destination it had always been moving toward. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that Joseph and Nicodemus did this together. Both were members of the Jewish ruling establishment. Both had followed Jesus privately while presenting a different face in their professional lives. Both had lived in that interior tension for however long their belief had been growing. Neither of them is recorded anywhere in the Gospels as having spoken openly about their conviction before this moment. And then, on the same Friday afternoon, they found themselves in the same garden with the same purpose. Whether they had known about each other before that day, the Bible does not say. They moved in the same circles: the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the interconnected world of Jerusalem's religious leadership. So it is possible that some signal had passed between them earlier. A word at the margin of a council meeting, a small indication that each was not entirely alone in what he privately held. Or the garden may have been the first moment either of them knew. But the practical reality of that evening is its own point. The work of preparing a body for burial within the compressed window before sundown required more than one set of hands. The 75 pounds of spices Nicodemus had brought were not something one man manages alone while also preparing a burial. They were not simply companions in conviction. They were practically necessary to each other. Sometimes the people who most understand what you privately carry are already in the rooms where you spend your days. And sometimes it takes a single moment of costly, open action for the walls between you to finally come down. If you have been following this story carefully, something in it may have located you. Not in a general way, but specifically. The kind of specific that arrives quietly while you are listening to something else. Most people who will ever hear this account will never face the particular circumstances Joseph faced. But most people know what it is to believe something in a setting that makes belief expensive. A workplace where the values you actually hold are quietly mocked. A family where faith is treated as something to eventually outgrow. A social circle where saying what you genuinely think would mark you as out of step with everyone around you. The gap between what you carry inwardly and what you are willing to say out loud is not unique to first-century Jerusalem. What this story does not do is hand you a formula for timing. It does not tell you that waiting is always wrong or that every moment of silence is a failure. Luke calls Joseph a good and righteous man without making any note of the time he spent in silence. The story shows that the gap eventually closes, either because you decide to close it or because a moment arrives that forces it closed. Joseph's moment came uninvited, on the worst possible afternoon, with the worst possible visible outcome surrounding it. His teacher was dead. The disciples were gone. Stepping forward had no visible upside. And still the moment came, and it required an answer. And Joseph gave one. The shape of your moment will be different. But if something in this story touched a specific thought, a situation, a conversation, a decision that has been waiting longer than it should, I want to hear what it is. Leave a comment. Tell me what you are sitting with. And if this is the kind of content you want to keep finding, subscribe now and turn on the bell so you do not miss what comes next. These stories take real time to build, and I do not want you to miss the next one. When the burial was finished, a large stone was rolled across the entrance of the tomb. Then the Sabbath began. The garden went silent. To everyone who stood there on Friday evening, that stone meant one thing: a conclusion, the final word on something that had not gone the way anyone had hoped. the kind of ending that leaves no room for another sentence. But the tomb Joseph had prepared was not a conclusion. It was the compressed interval between the last visible thing and what had not yet appeared. The silence of that Saturday was not emptiness. It was the pause before something no stone had ever been built thick enough to hold. The Gospels are full of people who are not the loudest voice in the story. Not Peter, who spoke often and sometimes brilliantly and sometimes into empty air. Not the disciples who argued among themselves about greatness on the road. Not the religious leaders who challenged Jesus in public with the full apparatus of professional confidence. Somewhere in the margins of all that noise, there are people whose faith cost them something the text never fully itemizes, and whose single recorded moments carry more than pages of loud declaration. The woman who pressed through a crowd in silence to touch the edge of his garment without announcing herself and was healed. The father who came to Jesus and said plainly, "I believe, help my unbelief." The Roman centurion who had overseen the execution and, after hours of watching what no one watching it fully understood, said quietly that this man was the Son of God. And Joseph of Arimathea, who left no sermon, no letter, no recorded word in any gospel, and yet whose hands prepared the body of Jesus and placed it in a tomb where it would be found empty. He was one of the quiet ones. And in the specific moment where his particular life met something larger than himself, he was there. With the means, the access, the legal standing to approach Pilate, and a courage that had been building in him for years and had finally arrived. You do not need to be the loudest person in any room to have a necessary part in what God is doing. You do not need an unbroken record of public boldness to be capable of one genuine act of faithfulness. The role Joseph had was his, and he filled it when the time came. The quiet ones are in every generation. They do not always know who they are until the moment arrives and requires them. The burial of Jesus rarely receives the attention given to the crucifixion and resurrection. It is the middle part, the quiet interval between the worst thing and what followed. The part that happens when no one yet knows what is coming. But that interval is where Joseph of Arimathea stepped into the most significant moment of his recorded life. Not in triumph, not in clarity about how any of it would resolve. In the uncertainty of a Friday evening with a body to prepare, a tomb to surrender, and a Sabbath arriving that would seal everything in silence. He did not act because the way forward was clear. He acted because something in him had finally closed the distance between what he believed and what he was willing to do about it. The tomb was his. The access to Pilate was his. The courage was his, long in coming, but real when it arrived. And something spoken by Isaiah 7 centuries earlier came to its precise fulfillment in that movement. The resurrection did not reduce what Joseph did on Friday evening. It confirmed it. The empty tomb was significant precisely because the burial had been real, specific, witnessed, located in a known garden, prepared by identified hands. The grave cloths folded inside meant something because someone had wrapped them with care. The garden where Mary heard her name spoken in the early morning light was the same garden where Joseph had worked in the last hour before the Sabbath fell. Faithfulness given in the dark, at personal cost, without any visibility into what follows. That is not wasted. That is what this story demonstrates from the inside. Not from a distance, not as a principle, but from the ground of a real garden on a real Friday evening, confirmed by the silence of a Saturday and answered by a Sunday morning. That is the testimony of the stone, and the stone did not have the last word.